It's really lovely to have everyone join us today from all over. So good morning or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be joining from. We're really pleased to be able to gather you all together in this webinar where we're launching a new report. The report is called On Target, Accelerating Humanitarian Climate and Environmental Programming. So thank you for joining. I'll go over just some housekeeping before we begin. First of all, today's webinar will be recorded and will be held in English. You can turn on the auto-generated translated captions in this webinar. You can find this by selecting Show Captions, CC, at the bottom of the Zoom screen, which is also a reminder to our speakers to speak slowly so this translation can work. Please also feel very welcome to use the chat throughout the meeting. We firstly encourage you to introduce yourself and where you're calling from, but you can also use the chat to engage with the speakers and with each other throughout the webinar. And we'll also be leaving time for Q&A a bit later, so please also share your questions in the chat, and we'll come back to them later in the webinar. But before jumping in any further, I'll just briefly introduce myself. My name is Natasha Westheimer, and I'm joined by my colleague Nishani Jaimaha. We both are the co-coordinators of the Secretariat for the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations. And we're hosting this webinar together with ADAPT, who was commissioned to lead this report. And just briefly on today's webinar, after I share a bit of an overview of the objectives of the report we're launching, we'll spend most of the time hearing from ADAPT and from our speakers. So first, we'll hear from Alexa Neddy and Paul Knox-Clark from ADAPT on the key findings and learnings from the report. And then we'll spend the remainder of the hour in a panel discussion with three of the case study organizations, CARE, Welthungerhilfe, and the Nabit Development and Evolution Organization. My colleague Nishani will be facilitating this discussion, so I'll leave it to her to introduce our panelists a bit later. And as I mentioned, we'll leave some time for Q&A, so share your questions in the chat and we'll come back to them. We're really looking forward to this discussion and particularly to showcase some of the learnings amongst organizations in meeting the commitments of the Charter. As with the report, we really hope that from hearing about organizations' experiences and hearing from our speakers that it can inspire action, particularly for signatories of the Charter that have yet to set targets. Before jumping into the report findings, I wanted to share a short overview of the Charter itself and why we commissioned this report. The Charter is really short. It's 7 commitments, and there is an implicit hierarchy between them. We have our what are we doing, how are we doing it, and then how do we hold ourselves and our sector accountable. The first two, the yellow, are really the backbone of the text. The first commitment highlights the importance of reducing risks and vulnerabilities through an increased focus on climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, early warning, and anticipatory action. The second commitment is in line with our do no harm principle and calls on the sector to reduce its emissions and responsibly use natural resources, manage our water, prevent waste, pollution, those sorts of things. The next 4 commitments in the middle focus on how we achieve our ambitions. The third commitment is about localization. It's about meaningful engagement of communities and community level capacities, their knowledge and resources. The fourth commitment is about knowledge. Really, it's about producing, sharing, and utilizing data and analysis on climate and environmental risks. It's also about bridging some of the disparities in data access. The fifth commitment is all about collaboration. It's about complementing one another, sharing lessons learned, really maximizing the capacities of different organizations. It's about working not just within the sector, but also beyond the humanitarian sector. And the sixth commitment is about advocacy. It's advocating for more ambitious climate action and environmental protection. It's advocating to leave no one behind. It's the opportunity to leverage and harness really the legal and policy frameworks and processes to better channel resources and attention towards the at-risk populations that we work with. And the last commitment is about mutual accountability. And I'll zoom in on this for a moment. While the charter is not a legally binding document, it's voluntary. Within a year of signing the charter, organizations are expected to submit targets to these commitments that really spell out how an organization is planning to take action, how they're planning to implement these commitments. And each organization will develop its own targets based on its unique capacities and mandate. We decided to launch this study just 6 months after we started operating as a secretariat because we understood that organizations face challenges with developing targets towards the commitment. We heard this from organizations we met with. We heard it in a survey that we conducted within the first month of starting our work. It was also something that when there was consultations with signatories before the Secretariat was established, it was part of that process that ultimately led to the operation of the Secretariat as a support hub to organizations. So whether it's the lack of technical expertise or just an uncertainty about where to begin with setting targets, organizations and signatories were asking for support. The challenge is it's not a one-size-fits-all solution for targets. Humanitarian organizations operate in diverse and complex environments. Each organization has its own unique challenges, but also its own unique opportunities for integrating climate and environmental programming. And the approach to setting targets, therefore, varies quite widely, depending on factors such as the organization's size, its geographic focus, the resources they have available, the populations they serve. And with this diversity, we also know that there's a growing desire to learn from the experiences of other organizations. Again, this is something we heard in our survey and from people we spoke with. So we wanted to better understand and showcase how organizations are setting targets or action plans or taking into consideration climate and environment in their programs. So we commissioned this report with this as the primary objective, to be able to share case studies and insights on how signatories are integrating the climate and environment charter and the commitments themselves into their work. And with that, I'll hand the floor over to Alexa and Paul to share about what they learned.
Thank you so much. If you could just let me know when you can see my screen, that would be great.
We see it. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Natasha, for that introduction, a really powerful overview of the purpose and the mission of the Charter and its commitments more broadly, and also for framing why this piece exists and the work we did. Thanks also more broadly to Natasha and Nishani for all of your work to bring us as a humanitarian sector together, including through the commissioning of this piece and other events like this. This report was built on insights from 6 organizations who participated as case studies, combined with insights from a workshop in Bangkok focused on mainstreaming climate and environmental considerations in humanitarian action. I just wanted to start with a huge thank you to every single organization who's participated. It is because of you that we're able to showcase so much inspiring, very encouraging work to meet these commitments. Organizations vary really widely in terms of size, region of operations, specialisms, and ways of working. But in each and every case, there were so many examples of organizations demonstrating excellent practice and going above and beyond to make each of these commitments a reality. There's a great deal to celebrate in the progress that has been made amongst signatory organizations. And at the same time, building on Natasha's introduction, we know that we need to do more as a sector to accelerate our efforts in this area. The commitments themselves are an important step in conceptualizing what we need to do, but understanding how well we're currently doing that and where we hope to go in the future is an equally important part. So for that reason, this piece and the subsequent report that's been published is really a tale of two halves. The first part of the research very much aims to showcase some of the ways that organisations have realised each of the first 6 commitments in turn, but also to explore some of the structural barriers that pose challenges in some of these areas. Whilst the second part of this research focus on that 7th commitment, exploring the processes, benefits, and lessons learned from setting these targets. Our hope is that this piece actually provides a really uplifting and encouraging insight into the creativity, dedication of the sector, and that through the real world examples, different organizations at all stages in their journey in meeting these commitments can identify with some of these actions, either as inspiration for future approaches or as evidence of the value of what they're currently doing. We can start with part A, really how are different organizations making a reality of these commitments? Because we're shortly going to be hearing from 3 representatives from case study organizations, I'm not going to give you too many of the real world examples, but I would like to share a few of the headline trends. Overwhelmingly, as I've mentioned, there has been so much to celebrate and a huge diversity of work taking place to realize these commitments. That includes work that organizations were already doing that links to other areas of humanitarian program quality and good practice, linked, for example, to grand bargain or to equitable partnerships with local organizations or to meeting the CHS commitments. And in many cases, we also see that activities and approaches that are connected to one commitment or that organizations conceptualize as meeting one commitment have really important links to others. An example of this could be, for example, provision of drought-resistant seeds, which is something that we have seen and is a really valuable intervention. Someone may think that this is really the way to meet commitment 1. We're helping communities to adapt to the impacts of climate crises and a changing kind of level of unpredictability in terms of agricultural practices. And they are, absolutely. But by doing that, especially if that organization also focused on local procurement or making sure that those seeds weren't distributed in plastic bags, they might also be meeting commitment 2 by really ensuring that they're not contributing to environmental degradation. They might be embracing local and traditional methods of agriculture, working with local actors and local communities to make sure that those approaches are preserved in their work, and that would be meeting commitment 3. They probably need some information and some data about changing environmental conditions. And so they're probably really delivering on commitment 4 while they plan and implement this program. It's likely that there's been some collaboration outside of the sector to procure these drought-resistant seeds. There's been research that's gone into that. And it's very likely that almost all of these organizations will in some way be showcasing the importance of such work. And therefore, they're also meeting commitment 6. So that has come across really strongly, and we're really keen to make sure that organizations are able to kind of celebrate and really build on some of those links. Particular things that we saw some really great evidence of was around commitment 2, particularly within some larger organizations that have got some brilliant policy frameworks and some really excellent, robust mechanisms to measure and reduce their emissions. And also seen so many organizations of all sizes really being able to connect climate change adaptation efforts, which can often be really scary and really feel like a real jargon term, to much of the work they were already doing that used to fall under these really classic sectors of food and health and sanitation. And that's been excellent. There have, of course, been some challenges. Securing funding almost goes without saying, but it's just as challenging for new programs that organizations might want to do that are specifically climate and environment focused. as it is for their wider efforts that could also be seen to be meeting the commitments and a part of their existing ways of working. There are some situations where organisations reported some challenges in raising awareness about the importance of preserving local environment with affected communities. And certainly staff and volunteer knowledge and capacity can be a challenge. Some organisations reported that there's so much jargon related to work in this area, it can feel very exclusive, can feel like there's a big learning curve. At the same time, sometimes accessing data and information, early warning systems or forecasting can be quite difficult, and it can sometimes be limited to networks which, if the organisation isn't a part of, can be quite hard to really engage with at all. And then, of course, there are ethical dilemmas. We are all dealing with a time of increased humanitarian needs, increased unpredictability, and some may question where you draw the line in meeting these commitments versus trying to reach as many people as you can. We think you can do both, and that's been demonstrated quite powerfully in some of the case studies within the report. And all of that is essential, but it's actually very difficult for us as a sector to conceptualize why we're doing what we're doing without linking that into Commitment 7 and setting some of these targets. Otherwise, as one respondent said in an interview, might be like getting into an airplane without knowing your destination. And that's true because actually all organizations are reaching really great heights in meeting these commitments. But if you're not able to really define for yourself and for others where you're heading, that can be really hard to really conceptualize in the longer term. So pretty much every single person that we spoke to said that the process of setting targets, whether it was just for the charter, just against these commitments, or whether it was part of a wider strategy and target setting process, had a positive effect on their ability to make progress. There was a number of different reasons that were reported for this, but a few that came out particularly strongly was the sense of not only setting a direction within the organisation, but being able to organise around that, being able to bring people from different parts of the organisation together in pursuit of a common goal. Many felt that actually by setting a target that was maybe a little bit ambitious, it certainly increased the focus within the organisation and the level of effort that was put into meeting that, because suddenly you knew what meeting that looked like. And many people spoke about the positive benefits of having some accountability within the organisation, within its leadership, but also externally to really demonstrate where you're heading. So that was great. In terms of insights about the targets themselves, there's far too much to cover in just 3 minutes, but we can break these down really into learnings about how to actually word your target. Like, what should you include in the language of the target? And what is it like to set a target and to work with a target within the organisation? Within the kind of first part of that, like how do we phrase our targets? There was 5 areas that came out as being particularly important. The level of ambition, finding a balance there between overwhelming and kind of too easy. Putting a time scale on things. Is this time bound? By when will you start or by when will you achieve this? Quantification was in many cases relevant, and by that we mean how many, can you put a number on this? Like, how many activities are you planning to do, or how many people are you planning to reach? And specificity mattered in terms of, are you able to really clearly define exactly what it is that you're working towards? But I think the factor that needs the most unpacking out of all of these is actually, what on earth are we going to measure in the targets? And there really are 2 camps we found. You could measure the goal, your overall vision for what you hope you will achieve. And some organizations took this quite far, and their goal is to reduce displacement as a result of climate crises, for example. Others would prefer to think about steps towards that goal, which tend to be activities within the organisation and things that they have a bit more control over. And that could be number of water points rehabilitated, number of training sessions delivered. And they have powerful effects on the overall goal, but it's not the goal itself. There are pros and cons to both. Some organisations felt that the goal is actually what matters. That's our purpose, that's our vision. So why wouldn't we strive for that? But it can be difficult to measure that. How are we really going to know whether we've achieved that when there's so many other factors at play? Equally, it's much easier within an organization to measure your activities. What are you personally doing as a team? But sometimes you can lose a little bit of sight of how does that connect back to the commitment itself and to your overall purpose. So there's no one right answer there, but definitely a really, really interesting area that came out of the report. And then our final learnings related really to the process of setting targets. And again, here, there are many, but two I think of the most important ones across all organizations was thinking carefully about who should be involved in this process. Because when only one or two people were assigned as the focal point, sometimes there's a bit of a bias towards that person's area of expertise or their role description. And actually, there might be a lot more happening within the organization and it's just not quite captured. Sometimes that's an intentional choice, but sometimes I think it's not always. And the other balance that organizations kind of navigate in different ways was, should we focus on setting targets against what we're already doing? Let's figure out how our current work meets the commitments and let's double down on that. Or should we use those commitments as a springboard to imagine and reimagine what our work could look like? And that's risky, right, to an extent, because you're setting lots of targets of things you'd like to do, but you've never done before. So finding that balance and finding what's appropriate for your organization, I think, was really key. Follow up, of course, matters as well. And the thing that came out the most strongly from that was that if it wasn't thought about at the time of setting the targets, it was very, very difficult to know at a later stage how to follow up on the target. So having a plan within the organization and a plan for how you'll handle it if you exceed your target or if you don't meet it was emerging as being really key. So to conclude, really, there are four key takeaways, and they're not hard and fast rules, but organizations could consider whether they're setting targets for the first time ever or thinking about revising some of their targets. The balance between new and existing activities, as we spoke about, how they can build links across the commitments, both within their targets and within their own work, how they can design those follow-up and monitoring approaches, and how they can make sure that all of this stays linked to their overall vision. So I hope that's helpful as just an overview. The full report is now available. There's a link in the chat, and we really hope you enjoy it and find it useful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alexa, for sharing these really useful insights, trends, and learnings you've gleaned from the case studies and the process. And today, we want to hear from some of the charter signatories themselves who've been doing this process and how they've been working towards meeting the commitments to the charter. And we have three speakers who I would like to introduce. Thuy Binh Nguyen is a program quality lead at CARE Climate Justice Center. She is responsible for providing technical support for the global and regional initiatives and partnerships in climate justice, strengthening the capacity of CARE country officers and partner organizations in the area of climate change resilience, as well as facilitating knowledge management and learning in these areas. She's also a board member of the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations. Thank you very much. Next is NABID Development and Evolution Organization, or NDEO, which is a Yemeni youth-led organization established in 2019. NDEO operates in the humanitarian and climate sectors, focusing on sustainable projects aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Its core priorities include ending poverty, combating hunger, promoting education and healthcare, ensuring access to clean water and sanitation, utilizing affordable and clean energy, advancing gender equality, and fostering climate action through modern, neutral, and transparent approaches. And last but not least, we've got Julia Wunscher, I hope I pronounce your name right, is working as the sustainability expert at Welthungerhilfe, WHH. She is responsible for the organization's sustainability efforts, such as carbon footprint and related decarbonizing measures of WHH's operations. So I would like to kickstart this conversation as we're also noting time. I'd like to start with Nabid. Could you give us any examples or an example of how climate change is affecting communities that you work with? And speak about how you've been able to incorporate climate change adaptation into your work. And this is related to our commitment one. So over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. In Yemen, climate change is exacerbating the humanitarian crisis, with communities facing severe droughts, floods, and extreme weather. Some areas in Yemen they experience heat waves, while other areas they have harsh cold, significantly affecting access to water and food security. And we always find that women and girls, particularly in rural areas, they bear the greatest burden as water scarcity forces them to walk long distance, increasing health risks such as waterborne disease and malnutrition. In response to that, NOBD organization has integrated climate adaptation into its multi-sector humanitarian programs, focusing on food security, wash, and shelter. For example, to combat increasing droughts and extreme weather, NDEO has provided 60 farmers with greenhouses, resilient seeds, and drip irrigation systems to improve water efficiency and protect crops from climate fluctuations. This has extended harvesting periods from 2 months to 6 months and enhanced the food security. This model has been successful in cold areas, and we are currently developing new models that suits for hotter regions. Also, to address water scarcity, NDEO, NOBD organization, has rehabilitated wells and installed solar pump systems, ensuring sustainable access to clean water for over 20,000 people. This intervention has significantly reduced the burden on women and girls who were previously responsible for fetching water from distant sources. Additionally, we have rehabilitated flood-damaged shelters, incorporating climate resilience construction for future climate shocks. This approach ensures that communities can remain safely in their homes while benefiting from improved water and agriculture interventions. Also, we recognize the gendered impact of climate change. This is why we conducted a research on how climate change affects women and girls' sexual and reproductive health in Taiz, Yemen. This study underscored the urgent need for climate-responsive policies and gender-sensitive programming in humanitarian interventions, and we are working on funding opportunities to implement climate adaptation projects for those affected communities. Over to you.
Thanks so much. Really interesting, the model you've been using. And I'd like to quickly pass on to either Julia or Tubin, if you have any insights into what you've been doing or examples from your end.
Well, thanks a lot, Nishani. I can start first. Just like many organizations, CARE is also has been working on climate justice for a long time. Climate justice is one of our impacts areas at CARE International. And as much as NAB, we have developing a lot of adaptation program, but we're also trying to integrate climate change in all across humanitarian and development programs. So how are we going to do that? One of the tools that we are using is the climate resilience marker. So CARE developed a tool so-called climate resilience marker, and it is a mandatory tool for all our programs. Every projects and program at the beginning, we need to use the climate marker to make sure that climate change is taken into consideration in our program, and also to make sure that we can contribute to build the climate resilience wherever in humanitarian, in development, in education, in health. So I think that is also something we try to do to make sure that climate change is integrated systematically across the organization. Over to you, Nishani.
Thanks. Thanks so much. We'll maybe go on next to actually Bin. Over to you on hearing a little bit about commitment to and focusing on commitment to. For organizations who are maybe systematically working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, could you tell us how you are measuring emissions and what you're doing to minimize the impact? And I'll come back later on to other speakers.
Thanks a lot, Nishani. Indeed, at CARE, we need to walk our talk, right? We not just can call on everyone to reduce the carbon emissions without us taking an example. So since a long time, we have been working actively to reduce our environment and climate impacts. And as part of that, we, since 2023, having a global confederation policy, so-called climate and environment policy. So this is a confederation-wide, organization-wide policy applying for 109 or more CARE offices across the world. And as part of this policy, we are committed to reduce 50% of our carbon emission by 2030. And this is absolute reduction. In order and how we can measure, actually, we starting a long time ago, the measurements in 2019, we're already starting measuring our carbon emission, especially related to flights, vehicle use, and office energy. And this 50% reductions is also setting based on these calculations for us to track and also to make sure that we are on the right track. Just talking quickly also about carbon offsetting, because this 50% reduction is absolute reductions and carbon offsetting is not integrated in our target. We at CARE, we very much acknowledge that carbon offsetting can be a temporary approach to reduce the carbon emissions, but it should not be, and it should be a standalone. It should be integrated in a comprehensive reductions strategies, and carbon finance, why continue to be considered within CARE. We move beyond the thinking that carbon finance is to generate carbon credit, but most importantly, it has to build the resilience of the community. It has to build adaptive capacities of the communities. It needs to be sustainable, and it needs to be based on a fair share of benefits. So a little bit of, looking into carbon emissions in different size and different programs and also offices. Over to you, Nishani.
Thanks, Tuibin. And I'm wondering, maybe I'd like, to hear from you, Nabid or Julia, on how you're working to raise awareness of the importance of minimizing environmental damage within your programs. Would be really interesting for those online.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe I can share an example. So at Welthungerhilfe, we are also measuring our emissions. We're using the Humanitarian carbon calculator for this. So it has simplified our work immensely since this is out. And over the years, we now increased our scope and are now measuring our emissions from all our offices, including energy, fleet, business trips, purchased goods and services, and waste. Our decarbonization efforts include the systematic replacement of power generators with solar systems, as well as a travel policy and fleet optimization, for which we are closely working together with Fleet Forum. And like for CARE, our focus is not on offsetting, but we do offset emissions from our flights for now. And we are currently also looking into how we can measure our emissions from the projects, but also quantifying positive contributions to climate change mitigation from the projects, for example, through sustainable land use management. Over to you, Menabd, if you have any additions.
For us, we work more on adaptation, but also we focus on minimizing environmental impact while raising awareness about sustainable practices. We have reduced paper use by shifting to online forms and avoiding unnecessary printing. Though we continue improving in this area, our suppliers also are committed to environmental protection, and we plan to strengthen contract terms to ensure waste reduction. Beyond awareness, we take action, supporting hygiene boxes, maintaining tracks to reduce diseases risk, and installing solar systems in different areas in Yemen to help farmers access to water sustainably. This year, we aim to provide tools and awareness for waste separation, reinforcing our commitment to environment responsibility. Over to you, Nishani.
Thanks so much for both your input. And on Julia, I'd like to maybe go on to your commitment number 3. And Weltunga Hilfe has been working towards enhancing local leadership in a variety of ways. Could you tell us about a little bit more about this and about how your work under the Charter around localization in other fora, such as the Grand Bargain, the core humanitarian standards, etc. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Nishani, for the question. So Weltunga Hilfe is driving humanitarian systems change to put local leadership at the center of humanitarian efforts. We focus on strengthening local organizations and giving communities the tools to take charge of their own future, while also acknowledging what communities are already doing as agents of their own realities and first responders in times of crisis. This aligns closely with the broader global efforts like the Grand Bargain you mentioned and the core humanitarian standard that push for more direct and flexible funding, decision-making power, and recognition for local actors in the humanitarian system. Weltunga Hilfe has been doing this in a variety of ways. A key focus is partnering with civil society organizations, and through these partnerships, we work collaboratively to create an environment that strengthens local actors, making them more independent and better equipped to advocate for their communities and lead responses. A great example is one of our flagship programs in this space of localization, focusing on greater effectiveness and timeliness in humanitarian emergency response, short Together. And this Together created a space for local and national NGOs to become stronger players in humanitarian action, and is currently in the second phase, where we focus on mentoring and capacity sharing in up to 120 local NGOs. This being said, it's also essential that communities themselves are at the center of our projects. Placing local people's perspective and ideas at the center of humanitarian action ensures that they have ownership and that systems are built in a way that is effective and relevant to the local realities, especially as they are also at the forefront of fighting the climate crisis. To put this into practice, WHH is connecting 2 humanitarian system changes, one towards localization and one towards anticipation, meaning a more forward-thinking humanitarian system that is acting before the crisis unfolds to happen. I'd like to read out a statement from our local partner, Barnabas Muhoma from Farm Community Trust in Zimbabwe, which says, "By truly empowering communities to lead, we enable them to prioritize their most pressing issues, assess their impacts, and uncover root causes. My experiences in Imbira district revealed that while heavy rains upstream bring unpredictable flooding, they also enrich floodplains vital for livelihoods. By actively listening and aligning with community actors, engaged agencies can ensure their efforts complement existing initiatives, emphasizing people-led solutions that add real value." So to conclude, Weltunga Hilfe's approach to localization is all about providing space for and offering support to local communities to take the lead. By strengthening civil society, investing in local capacity, and pushing for more equitable partnerships, we try to contribute to creating a more inclusive, effective, and locally led humanitarian system. Thank you, and back to you, Nishani.
Thanks. I mean, really interesting ways of working from an international organization. And I think in terms of target setting process, and maybe I'd go to Bin first to find out if it would be really, what would your advice be, and what would your advice to an organization similar to yours, which is setting targets for the first time or looking to revise their targets? What would that advice look like, Bin?
Thanks a lot, Nishani. Indeed, a very interesting questions, because within CARE, we have several discussions on the setting the targets. At the beginning, we was like, oh, shall we set the targets for all the commitments? Because actually most of us, like Lexi said at the beginning, we are working in all the commitments, and different commitments are connecting to each other. One thing can be looking at different perspectives. But at the same time, when we set the commitments, one of the key things we would asking ourselves is that how we can be accountable for the target that we set. How can we track the progress that we are doing. And when the questions are accountable, then we set things into what we call SMART, something time-bound, something measurable. And at the end of the day, we're pointing out to setting the commitments or the target for the first two commitments, very much on how we can build the adaptive capacities, the climate resilience for the communities, and how we can also reduce our carbon footprints. For other commitments, we also showcase how we're contributing to, but we do not set really clear targets. So my suggestions is always keeping in mind that setting a target is also responsible for the targets, and in order to make sure that you are accountable, but at the same time not putting additional on reporting to your team, which is you have already hundreds of reports to do, it is important to align our external commitments with our internal strategies. Actually, the target that we set is 25 million people. And this is also the aims of our climate justice strategies. So as long as you align your internal organizational strategies with your external commitments, it helps the organizational to have a vision, to have a better connection, to be more accountable. At the same time, operationally, it is also, let's say, reducing or not putting additional burdens on our reporting system. So a little bit of the advice. Hope it was helpful.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, accountability is important, right? You can set targets and then not be able to meet them. You know, what does that look like? And maybe Julia, any advice from your end on how your target setting process was for those on the call?
Yeah, thank you. I think we took a very similar approach, like Thuy Bin. We took an interdisciplinary approach. We tried to involve all other teams in WHH to make the best targets possible. Most of the targets were already part of our annual plans and strategies, but rethinking them in light of the Climate Charter was a very good exercise for us that we repeat every year now. One of our priorities was the measurability. So each target is really tied to a specific deadline, so to say, and a specific percentage. So we start most of them with a by 2028, by 2030, 80% of our country strategies will be based on disaster risk analysis, or 50% of our projects will integrate climate resilient measures. So that helped us a lot to be measurable and accountable for our targets. And finally, setting these ambitious targets that also helped us to engage more effectively with donors and partners, demonstrating our commitment to the climate resilience. And beyond that, it really inspired us and motivated our teams, giving them a tangible way to see the impact of their work and also be part of a collective effort that extends beyond our own organization. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, measurability is important. You know, how do we measure progress towards a target? And maybe Naber, do you have any insights or advice to others on how your process for target setting was? Over to you.
Yeah. Well, for us, we think that climate change is exacerbating the humanitarian situation. We think that having climate action integrating in the humanitarian and development work is essential. For us, setting clear targets is essential for ensuring accountability, measuring progress, and driving meaningful impact. Targets helps us align actions with long-term sustainability goals while maintaining flexibility to respond to urgent needs. They provide us with a roadmap to scale successful initiatives and improve program efficiency. We had many discussions inside the organization. We also engaged directly with the communities to understand their needs and challenges, to ensure that targets reflect real priorities rather than external assumptions. We have integrated the 6 commitments into our annual plan, and they are reviewed annually through our ERB system. And this year, for the first time, we initially since we set our targets, we conducted a thorough review and adjust them, and they made them more measurable. We tried to have smart targets. We define specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound goals. My advice will be, I prefer that organizations focus on few key areas where they can make measurable impact, then expand as capacity grows, and ensure the targets reflect their realities and priorities. Also, the humanitarian context change rapidly. So always allow a room to adapt targets while maintaining accountability. Strong baseline data make it easier to track progress and demonstrate impact. Also, the targets should consider long-term resilience, not just immediate outputs. Over to you, Nishani.
Thanks. I mean, really interesting. You pointed out that you were also aligning them with the SDGs, and absolutely spot on. You know, if you are not looking at how community realities and priorities are, and changing that accordingly with the changing humanitarian context is important also when we are looking at targets, revising them, looking at if they're applicable or not. I mean, we have, I think, quite a lot of questions coming in. So I'm going to basically hand over to Natasha to look at all the questions coming into our speakers. Over to you, Natasha.
Thank you, Nishani, and thank you very much to the panelists. It was really interesting to hear your advice and guidance on target setting. It's something that Nishani and I get to do as part of our job, and hearing from organizations as well on what your advice is, that's helpful for us, and it's certainly something that will continue to try to gather insights from organizations that we can relay to others. First of all, we're in a meeting room, not a Zoom webinar, which gives us the benefit of allowing people to raise their hands if they have questions they want to ask directly. There are a couple of questions that came in in the chat. I'll start with the first one. Really is for any one of our speakers, and I think I just want to ask directly. What challenges are you facing in implementing the charter and in meeting the commitments? Apart from the money, we know that one, apart from having enough funding and resources, what other challenges are you facing? And maybe if you do have a challenge or you have some insights on how you can navigate those, it would be great to hear that too. Do any of our speakers want to take on that question?
Maybe I can start then, and
Julia.
maybe the others can add. So for us, I think it's always a challenge to bring the topic back on the table of everyone's busy work days, and then just making sure everyone is in a good space to think about these targets. But it's been not only a challenge, but also very good to focus on the Climate Charter commitments, have this guidance, have a lot of guidance from the Climate Charter website that has been incredibly helpful. But just to organize it, to have everyone in the same room, even virtually, for us is the challenge of its own.
I can certainly imagine that. Bin or Nabid, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I can go next as well. I think competing priorities, as mentioned at the very beginning, like people would say, oh, like what's next after gender? Now you have climate, now you have environment. And then, how to convince people to take that into consideration. And also for big organization, say from the beginning, we have diverse from someone a big huge office in Ethiopia to a small office in Vanuatu, how we can having there will never be anything one fits all. Tailor specific measures is very important. So I just would like also to reflect on what is happening recently, with everything's happening to our 8 sectors. It will be more challenging to continue working on climate and environment. But then I think it is more important than ever that we stay committed to the chapters, that for only humanitarians, that we stay engaged and committed to reduce the climate and environment impacts. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
For us,
Yes.
it's not. I'll be brave. Just I think the lack of humanitarian, humanitarian resources and also the expertise sometimes in climate, because when you include climate in the humanitarian work, you need some expertise. I think it's this challenge, and sometimes I think it's also related to the funding, because it's also a matter of funding. So it's related to funding, yeah.
Right, of course. You know, and it is always related to funding, and that's also, I mean, of course, a key point, even though I was saying we should put it aside, it's always connected. Binal, please jump in. I was going to turn to your question in the chat next, but better that it comes from you directly. So please go ahead.
Thank you. We were together with Nishani in the earlier panel organized by FAO, and delighted because this is the first session where I am really looking at the intersection of climate, environment, and then indigenous people and conflict. I come from the state of Manipur in India's northeast, where there is an ongoing violent conflict, which has resulted in more than 80,000 people currently displaced and living in more than 300 plus relief camps. And we are working very closely to mitigate this. My question was like, again, I was thrilled to see the charter, but I wanted to know if any indigenous communities, organizations were involved in it, because I'm just curious. And then if yes, great. If no, no worries. How are you planning to then bring in, because I see with more than 80% of the global conflicts, 80% of the global conflicts happening in biodiversity hotspots where indigenous people live. I think as an indigenous woman working in the intersection of climate conflict, I really feel, and humanitarian issue, I feel it's a need of the hour to bring us in. We are talking about 476 million indigenous people living in 90 countries and territories. Thank you to everyone for your work, and just wanted to see how we can continue to sort of journey together in this really critical work. Thank you.
Thank you, Binal, for that important reflection and question. Nishani, I'm going to turn to you because your involvement in the charter predates the Secretariat, and you were involved in the process of the charter development for this question.
That is a good question. I can't recall if we had any specific indigenous organizations joining. We did have quite a lot of local national organizations, and this is, but one of the things we heard from all of them, and that's why the specific commitment number 3 really does look at local indigenous knowledge, incorporating that into the programming of humanitarian action. And I'm sure we have maybe Thoibin and others on the call who can share some expertise and experiences of how organizations actually have been doing this. And this is where we're really trying to bridge that gap between the humanitarian and the looking at the more broader ecosystem of where we are working in and how we're incorporating some of this knowledge and practice into the work we do.
Yes, I can take a little bit on that. I think it is very much in the implementing process, and I totally agree with you. I think indigenous organizations should be also part of the charter signatories and also develop the charter, monitor the charter per se. But I think within CARE, it is very important, also align with what Julia said before. We're working very much with local actors. And it is just not about capacity building for local actors, but also make sure that their voice are listened to by power holders in the global north, as we talked about it. So I think it is very important that our work with the local actors have to be in, let's say, in 2 legs at the same time. One is to build the capacities, empower local organization, indigenous organization, but the other one is to make sure that their voice is heard, that their ideas and their initiatives are taken into account and into actions. So advocacy and capacity building have to go along line with each other. And this is what CARE is doing. You know, we have these 2 pillars in parallel, amplifying the voice of the civil society organization, including indigenous communities, but also make sure that power holders are listening to them and integrating in the action and programming. I hope I answer part of your question.
Thank you.
And Binal, thank you very much for your question. It's something that at the Secretariat, we'd be keen to continue learning about how we can also improve our engagement of Indigenous voices and Indigenous knowledge and how we're doing this work as well. And so we'll follow up with you directly, and we'd love to continue the conversation. But with that, I'll wrap us up for the day. I firstly just want to take a moment to put out a huge thank you to Alexa, to Paul and Philly from ADAPT, who put together this report and worked hard in really understanding and working with the case study organizations in really finding out some key insights that are going to be useful to the charter community. And we're excited that this report is now live and that we'll be sharing that. A big thank you to Bin and Nabid and Julia for your contributions in the panel, as well as to the other organizations that were involved in the case study report, whether that was CAFID, Swedish Red Cross, and Zamzam, as well as the organizations that participated in the Bangkok workshop that provided follow-up and insights that informed the report as well. So we'll be sharing the report along with other updates in our upcoming newsletter. If you are interested in signing up to the newsletter, you can do so on the website, and Nishani can share a link to that as well. We're also in the process of translating the report, so we'll translate it into Spanish, Arabic, and French for now. We'll be sure to notify you when that's complete. It may take a couple of weeks, but hopefully not too long. And for signatories on the call, what I wanted to remind you is that the Secretariat really was established to support charter signatories in meeting the commitments of the charter, whether that's through one-on-one support and conversations, webinars like this one, our newsletters and communications. We're available, we're here. And we offer target office hours. So if you want to schedule a 30-minute meeting, an hour meeting with us to jump on a quick call and troubleshoot your targets or brainstorm, please do schedule some time with us. We'd really be happy to chat. Part of what we do as well in supporting and referring signatories to expertise and guidance. So this report is part of that. We'll be sure that the resources that the organizations and panelists shared are also available, and we'll keep that posted in the event page from this webinar. And you can keep monitoring our website. We have a guidance page where we'll be rolling out over the course of the year a series of thematic pages that are a curated list of resources for the humanitarian sector on climate and environmental action. We've just put out a page on disaster risk reduction, where there's all sorts of tools, resources, beginner 101, what does DRR mean, to online learning, including some resources from CARE, for example, and their online learning tools and self-paced courses. And you can hear more about that as well in different events throughout HNPW. But with that, we'll wrap up here. A huge thank you again to ADAPT and to the panelists, and to those of you on the call who joined. Please do be in touch if you have any questions. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.